This is Sana Mudaffar, and this is part of a series of lectures highlighting the main ideas in Pelagia Goulimari's book, Literary Criticism and Theory, From Plato to Postcolonialism. This session is on Chapter 9, 20th-century North American Criticism, Close Reading to Interpretation, Modernism to Postmodernism, History to Histories. Emerging in the wake of slavery's abolition in 1863 and the collapse of Reconstruction in the 1870s, the Harlem Renaissance arose as African Americans continued to face disenfranchisement and systemic racial segregation. In search of safety, opportunity, and cultural self-determination, many Black Americans began migrating from the rural South to the urban North, transforming Harlem in New York City into a vibrant cultural hub. Influential figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey advocated for Black pride, education, and cultural self-assertion, laying the groundwork for a modernist Black movement. The Harlem Renaissance, also called the New Negro movement, developed during the 1920s, featuring artists like Alan Locke, James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay. Locke's The New Negro defined the new Black identity as urban, proud, and self-inventing, challenging dominant racial narratives. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance celebrated African American oral traditions and emphasized biculturalism, with Du Bois promoting spirituals as a cultural resource. Despite its vibrancy, the movement was disrupted by economic hardship during the Great Depression, revealing the vulnerability of Black artistic expression to structural realism. Nonetheless, the Harlem Renaissance shifted African American literature towards a deeper engagement with vernacular traditions and political consciousness. Later critics re-evaluated its role not as a derivative of Euro-American modernism, but as a radical and autonomous cultural modernism in its own right. Among the many figures who shaped the Harlem Renaissance, none were more central or enduring than Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, whose work grounded the movement in folk culture and everyday Black experience. Langston Hughes' 1926 essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, championed authentic Black art drawn from folk culture, rejecting middle-class mimicry of white norms. He celebrated the Black working class as the source of artistic originality and rooted jazz, blues, and spirituals in a collective oral heritage. Hughes argued that cultural self-loathing among Black elites stifled genuine creativity and called for fearless, unashamed Black expression. Zora Neale Hurston, though marginalized at the time, pioneered the study of Southern Black dialects and folklore, emphasizing their living, evolving nature. She described asymmetry and improvisation as hallmarks of Black aesthetics practiced by contemporary artists. She also critiqued publishing racism, which limited explorations of Black interiority and full selfhood in literature. Hurston asserted that Black authors were discouraged from writing complex, humanized Black characters due to entrenched reader biases. Both Hughes and Hurston refused to separate literature from broader cultural forms like music, dance, and oral storytelling, rooting their aesthetics in everyday Black life. Their work redefined literary value through cultural specificity and historical awareness, contesting dominant conceptions of literary greatness. In stark contrast to the Harlem Renaissance embrace of cultural context and expressive diversity, new criticism emerged within the academic mainstream to promote a depersonalized, text-centered model of literary evaluation. John Crow Ransom's 1938 essay, Criticism, Inc., marked the formal beginning of new criticism, advocating for a scientific and objective approach to literary text. Ransom insisted that criticism should restrict itself to the words on the page, excluding authorial intent, ethical concerns, or historical context. He defined close reading as the rigorous analysis of literary form, emphasizing poetry's technical device over subjective interpretation. Ransom's model excluded paraphrase, biography, and the effects of literature on the reader, favoring instead a professional, autonomous English discipline. New criticism thus positioned itself as an anti-humanist, anti-historicist mode of inquiry, aspiring to the status of scientific objectivity. This emphasis on objective criticism paralleled T.S. Eliot's early efforts to detach poetry from personal emotion and social reality. Though Ransom's agrarian background initially included ethical and regional concerns, he decisively abandoned them in favor of textual autonomy. For Ransom, literary criticism became a method of isolating the literary object, turning the poem into an impersonal, analyzable structure. This narrowing of literary study paved the way for other formalist critics to codify the principles of close reading into the dominant academic orthodoxy. Furthering the new critical emphasis on objectivity, William Wimsatt and Morno Beardsley's 1946 essay The Intentional Fallacy entrenched its rejection of authorial intention. They argued that the meaning of a poem is not tied to the author's biography or stated purpose, but to the internal coherence of the text. Literature, they insisted, neither mimics reality nor expresses internal sentiment. It is a linguistic fact that must be read impersonally. Like Ransom, they saw literary analysis as a science of textual structures, calling for a disciplined, objective reading practice. Clint Brooke extended these ideas in The Well Wrought Urn, famously opposing the hearsay of paraphrase and arguing for the unity of form and meaning. Drawing on I.I. Richards and Coleridge, Brooks emphasized poetry's capacity to harmonize paradox and ambiguity into a dynamic equilibrium. For Brooks, a poem's meaning resides in its organic structure, which resolves contradictions into aesthetic unity. He claimed that the critic's primary task was to discern this structure, equating literary greatness with formal complexity and balance. Though Brooks distanced himself from the psychological interest of Richards, he retained the belief that poetry reconciles conflicting experiences. Ultimately, Brooks' version of new criticism became the most influential in mid-century literary pedagogy, though its formalist dogma would later provoke critical backlash. Stanley Fish emerged as a central figure in the shift from formalism to reader-centered criticism, initially grounded in close reading, but ultimately dismantling the foundations of new criticism. His early work in reader response theory focused on how meaning unfolds over time through a reader's sequential engagement with the text. Fish argued that interpretation is not fixed in the text itself, but is activated by the reader's cognitive and cultural expectations. Over time, Fish moved away from the notion of a generic or ideal reader, developing the concept of interpretive communities, socially constructed groups that determine how texts are understood. For Fish, meaning is never inherent, but always contingent upon the norms, strategies, and assumptions of the community doing the reading. This relativism marked a dramatic break from new critical ideals of objectivity, coherence, and textual autonomy. By emphasizing reading as a historically situated act, Fish aligned literary criticism with post-structuralist concerns about language, knowledge, and truth. His work paved the way for later pluralists, feminists, and post-colonial critics who likewise rejected universal claims about literature. Though Fish dismantled the notion of fixed textual meaning, other critics like Northrop Frye responded to formalism's limitations by seeking new, systematic ways to understand literature's enduring structures. Challenging the narrowing tendencies of new criticism, Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism offered a more capacious theoretical vision grounded in myth, symbolism, and literary systematization. Frye proposed that literary criticism should become systematic and scientific, but he emphasized that this should be understood in a constructive, imaginative sense rather than a purely descriptive or empirical one. Rather than confining analysis to isolated texts, Frye called for a comprehensive conceptual framework capable of mapping the entire literary tradition as a unified mythic structure. He drew extensively on disciplines such as anthropology, psychoanalysis, theology, and medieval scriptural exegesis to articulate literature as a coherent and self-referencing symbolic system. Frye's central argument was that literature expresses collective human desires through recurring archetypal patterns, which cut across genres, cultures, and historical periods. These archetypes, structured around powerful binaries like apocalyptic versus demonic and innocence versus experience, form the foundational categories of his critical typology. He argued that the dominant critical paradigms of his time, such as new criticism, ethical criticism, and historical criticism, were each limited in scope and often mutually conflicting. By contrast, Frye's method of archetypal criticism offered a unifying approach that could integrate diverse traditions through a shared grammar of literary forms. His ultimate ambition was to reveal literature as an autonomous and intricately ordered universe of meaning, governed by internal laws and shaped by mythic coherence that transcends individual texts. The Black aesthetic movements of the 1960s and 70s, also known as the Black Arts Movement, emerged alongside Black Power as a cultural response to civil rights structures. Figures like Amiri Baraka, Larry O'Neill, and Addison Gale Jr. advocated for a distinctly Black art rooted in African American experience and addressed to a Black audience. This movement emphasized oral traditions, political autonomy, and aesthetic forms grounded in African American folklore, music, and speech. It rejected white-defined standards and called for Black-controlled publishing theater and criticism. The movement's essentialist belief in a fixed Black identity drew on the negritude tradition, but this led to reductive stereotypes and exclusions. Critics, especially Black women writers like Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, pushed back against the sexism and homophobia in its narrow ideals of representation. The Black aesthetic movement formalized earlier debates around Black cultural production, but its legacy is mixed, both empowering and limiting, at a moment when feminist critics were similarly reimagining literary value through the lens of gendered experience. Elaine Showalter's A Literature of Their Own aimed to reconstruct a tradition of British women writers from the Brontes to Doris Lessing. She proposed three phases: feminine, feminist, and female, through which women's writing evolved in relation to dominant male norms. Her project blended close reading, literary history, and biography, identifying recurring themes, figures, and plots in women's fiction. She emphasized women's ambivalence toward writing, their coded anger, and the recurring image of the private room or enclosed space. Showalter's canon prioritized middle and upper-class white women, eliding questions of race, empire, and class difference. She criticized writers like Woolf for retreating into formal aestheticism and repressing their political and sexual subjectivity. But despite its limits, her work was foundational for feminist literary criticism, shaping how gender, history, and form were read. Showalter redefined the terms of evaluation, using feminist liberation rather than formalist unity as the criterion of literary value. Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar's The Mad Woman in the Attic deepened the feminist critique by exploring the psychological and symbolic dimensions of women's writing. Their analysis focused on canonical white female authors such as Charlotte Bronte and Emily Dickinson, identifying shared tropes of madness, enclosure, and double selves. They theorized the mad woman as a surrogate for the silenced female artist, drawing attention to the tension between societal expectation and creative ambition. Their text mapped a coherent female literary tradition, but was critiqued for its essentialism, reliance on a unified subject, and narrow cultural lens. Later, in their 2000 introduction, the authors acknowledged critiques from scholars influenced by post-structuralism, post-colonial theory, and queer studies. They conceded that their initial vision of feminist solidarity had excluded perspectives shaped by race, class, and sexuality. Despite this, their collaborative methodology and emphasis on women's expressive strategies left a lasting mark on feminist theory. Gilbert and Gubar's approach combined psychoanalysis, formalism, and historicism, emphasizing literature's expressive and symptomatic functions. Their work encouraged a revaluation of women's voices, not only in fiction, but in literary theory itself. Although the field had since moved toward greater pluralism, their contribution remains a cornerstone in feminist literary genealogy, one that would soon be expanded and contested by critics foregrounding race, empire, and sexuality. A new generation of feminist critics, including Barbara Christian, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Alice Walker, and Guthrie Spivak, challenged the whiteness and elitism of early feminist literary criticism. They emphasized that race, class, and sexuality intersect with gender, demanding new frameworks for reading literature. Walker coined the term womanist to foreground Black women's cultural experience rooted in survival, community, and resistance. Her essay, Looking for Zora, catalyzed a renewed appreciation of Zora Neale Hurston's overlooked legacy. Bell Hooks critiqued postmodern rhetoric for excluding marginalized voices while appropriating the language of difference and otherness. Spivak, in contrast, examined colonial complicity in colonial texts, famously reading Bertha Mason and Jane Eyre as a sacrificed subaltern. These critics widened the scope of feminist criticism, demanding accountability to histories of imperialism and systemic exclusion, just as literary theory more broadly began turning toward the pluralist, anti-totalizing impulses of postmodernism. One hallmark of postmodern literature is its explicit use of intertextuality, texts that rewrite or reframe earlier texts, sometimes critically, sometimes playfully. Jane Rhys's White Sargasso Sea reimagined Jane Eyre from a point of view of Bertha Mason, exposing colonial violence in the original. Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children blends myth, memory, and history, referencing the Arabian Nights, Tristram Shandy, and Dickens to construct post-colonial identity. These works do not simply quote prior texts, they reinterpret them, contesting dominant historical narratives and reshaping cultural memory. Postmodern metafiction often dramatizes its own limitation, with narrators who question their own reliability, like Toni Morrison in Jazz or Salim in Midnight Children. This self-referentiality creates a doubled awareness. The narrative simultaneously tells a story and exposes the mechanism of storytelling. It challenges notions of literary truth and mirrors the post-structuralist insight that meaning is unstable, contingent, and always deferred. Metafiction thus becomes both an aesthetic strategy and an ethical act, alerting readers to the complexities of representation. Rather than withdrawing into abstraction, these texts insist that form itself can interrogate power, identity, and historical memory, a claim that leads to a full-fledged theory of postmodern historical fiction. Linda Hutcheon's concept of historiographic metafiction articulates the postmodern commitment to narrative self-consciousness, layered with a deep engagement with historical representation. In her view, postmodern literature does not abandon history altogether, but reframes it as plural, contested, mediated, and shaped by power and perspective. She praises texts like Beloved and Foe for combining formal experimentation with historical inquiry, resisting closure while giving voice to those previously silenced or erased. For Hutcheon, the strength of postmodernism lies precisely in its ability to represent history without assuming narrative mastery, coherence, or epistemic authority. Rather than offering a seamless or unified account of the past, these texts foreground narrative gaps, silences, erasures, and the inherently constructed nature of all historical storytelling. She argues that such works shift us from history with a capital H to histories, understood as local, multiple, fragmentary, and situated within competing discourses. In contrast to Jameson, who interprets postmodernism as a symptom of capitalist historical amnesia, Hutcheon sees it as ethically motivated and politically attuned. She connects its fragmentation and reflexibility to feminist, postcolonial, and minority discourses that seek to articulate subaltern or marginalized perspectives. Metafiction, then, is not a withdrawal from reality, but a mode of critical response that interrogates the conditions under which truth is constructed, narrated, and believed. In this view, postmodernism marks a possible new kind of realism, one that admits its own limitations, yet insists on bearing witness to historical complexity. In contrast to Hutcheon's ethically invested view of postmodernism, Frederick Jameson sees it as the cultural logic of late capitalism, a condition marked by superficiality, depthlessness, commodification, and the erosion of meaning. Jameson laments the replacement of distinct personal style with what he terms black parody or pastiche, along with a pervasive loss of emotional and aesthetic depth. In Jameson's view, postmodern literature no longer engages with real historical processes, but merely recycles their images, an effect he famously describes as the waning of historicity. He positions this critique in sharp contrast to Lyotard's celebratory embrace of pluralism, offering instead a Marxist framework that calls for cognitive mapping as a way to represent the complex structures of global capitalism. This mapping would require a new form of totalizing art capable of synthesizing local lived experience with abstract systems of economic and political knowledge. Yet Jameson's emphasis on political unity and totalization runs the risk of flattening cultural difference and ignoring the subversive potential of fragmented, localized narratives. His suspicion of postmodern playfulness and aesthetic innovation aligns him less with postmodern exuberance and more with modernist melancholy and its longing for lost coherence. Unlike Jameson's critical account of postmodernism as cultural decline, Lyotard celebrates it as a proliferation of incommensurable discourses and a space for creative dissent and disruption. He argues that truth does not arise from consensus or uniformity, but rather through agonistic interruption and the continual invention of new and surprising language games. For Lyotard, the sublime becomes a central aesthetic category, an effort to evoke what ultimately exceeds representation and resists containment. This aesthetic approach is especially relevant in the aftermath of historical atrocities like the Holocaust, where attempts at representation must avoid simplifying or domesticating intense suffering. In this context, postmodern literature functions as a form of witness, not by narrating the past in a straightforward term, but by gesturing towards its unrepresentable and unspeakable dimensions. Toni Morrison's Beloved, for instance, channels the spectral voices of the Middle Passage through fragmented, nonlinear storytelling that refuses closure or total comprehension. Such literary strategies resist appropriation and instead insist on alterity, enabling literature to approach trauma while acknowledging its irreducibility. Lyotard's insistence on ethical imagination stands in contrast with Jameson's call for unified critique, affirming postmodernism as a domain of critical openness, plurality, and care. This chapter traces the evolution of 20th-century North American criticism from the formalist rigor of new criticism to the pluralist energies of postmodern thought. It highlights the Harlem Renaissance as a foundational moment of cultural resistance that redefined Black modernism through oral tradition and political engagement. From Ransom to Brooks, the new critics emphasized close reading and formal unity, while Frye sought a mythic and systemic understanding of literature. Fish's reader response theory dismantled the illusion of objectivity, shifting attention to interpretive communities and the temporality of reading. Feminist and Black aesthetic movements questioned dominant paradigms, reconstructing canons and challenging exclusions based on race, gender, and class. Finally, the chapter presents postmodernism as a site of both anxiety and possibility, where intertextuality, metafiction, and ethical pluralism redefine the very purpose of literary criticism. Thank you for your attention.